The dust of Mercy Ridge tasted of failure. It clung to the back of Boone Fletcher's throat, a fine, gritty powder that no amount of cheap whiskey could wash away. He stood in the shadow of the Mercantile, watching the midday sun bake the life out of the street, and felt a familiar hollowness settle in his bones. It was the same hollow he'd carried for 10 years, a ghost that walked beside him, silent and heavy. That's when the world broke open. It started not with a bang, but with a scream. A single sharp cry from the first bank of Mercy Ridge that sliced through the afternoon torpor. Horses whinnied, townsfolk froze, and then the shots came, 3 quick cracks that sent birds scattering from the rooftops. Boone's hand went to the Colt peacemaker at his hip, an instinct carved into him by a life lived on the ragged edge of civilization. But his fingers stopped hovering over the worn leather of the holster. His feet felt rooted to the warped floorboards of the boardwalk, his blood turning to ice. The bank doors burst outward, and 3 men spilled into the street, bandanas pulled high over their faces. 2 of them were brutes, all muscle and nervous energy, stuffing canvas bags into their saddlebags. But the third, the leader, moved with a different kind of grace. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that billowed around him like smoke. He walked with an unhurried confidence that was more terrifying than any frantic haste. As the other 2 mounted up, he lingered, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces peering from behind barrels and doorways. A young woman, no older than 17, stumbled out of the dressmaker's shop, her eyes wide with shock. The leader's head snapped toward her, a predator spotting a flicker of movement. He glided toward her, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. "Well now," he said, his voice a low melodic drawl that carried unnervingly in the sudden silence. "What have we here?" He reached out, not for her money, but for the delicate silver locket hanging from a chain around her neck. The girl flinched, a small sob escaping her lips. "Please," she whispered. "It was my mother's." The man's fingers, clad in black leather gloves, closed around the locket. Everything belonged to someone once little Bird. He snapped the chain with a casual flick of his wrist and pocketed the silver oval. And Boone saw it. Not just a locket, but the locket. Identical. The same etched rose on the front, the same delicate clasp. A perfect, impossible twin to the one that had belonged to his sister Sarah. The one she was wearing the day she died. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a phantom rock slide crashing down on him. The smell of dust and cordite, the scream that was her name on his lips, the sight of her small hand reaching for him from beneath the rubble. He had been there. He had been the one who was supposed to protect her. And he had failed. He had frozen then, just as he was freezing now. Sheriff Miller, a good man with more belly than bravery, finally found his nerve. He emerged from his office, shotgun, leveled, his face pale but determined. "That's enough, Kane. Drop the trinket and get out of my town." The man in black turned a slow, almost lazy pivot. He smiled, a flash of white teeth beneath the bandana. "Sheriff," he said, his tone laced with a theatrical amusement. "Always a pleasure. But I'm afraid the name is Silas." Silas Kane drew his pistol with a liquid speed that defied the eye. The shotgun blast and the pistol shot were almost simultaneous. The sheriff's buckshot tore a chunk from the wooden awning above Silas's head. Silas's single bullet found its home in Sheriff Miller's chest. The sheriff staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust. The town went utterly still. The only sound was the jingle of Silas's spurs as he walked calmly to his horse, swinging into the saddle. He paused, his cold eyes scanning the street one last time, and they landed on Boone. For a split second, their gazes locked. There was no recognition in Silas's eyes, just a cold, dismissive contempt. But in that moment, Boone felt a new kind of chill, a sense that this wasn't random, that this violence was a language he was supposed to understand. Then Silas Kane and his men were gone. A cloud of ochre dust marking their retreat into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The spell broke. People rushed to the fallen sheriff, their cries and shouts filling the void. Boone didn't move. The gun at his hip felt like a ton of lead. He was a man who knew how to use it, a man who had survived things that should have killed him. But when it mattered, when a ghost from his past reached out and touched the present, he had done nothing. He had stood by and watched a good man die and a memory be stolen. The locket was gone. Again. The dust settled, covering the sheriff's blood, and the hollow place inside Boone Fletcher grew a little wider, a little deeper, and a whole lot colder. This time, he knew the ghost wouldn't just walk beside him. It would lead the way. Months bled into a harsh, unforgiving winter, and the memory of Sheriff Miller's death became another scar on the weathered face of Mercy Ridge. A new sheriff, a young man named Garvey, with cautious eyes and a desire to keep the peace by avoiding trouble, now wore the badge. The bank had been reimbursed by a federal insurer, and the townsfolk spoke of Silas Kane's raid in the hushed, mythic tones reserved for wildfires and plagues, a terrible act of nature that had passed them by. For Boone, however, it was a wound that refused to close. He retreated further into his solitude, his cabin on the edge of the timberline, becoming less a home and more a fortress against a world he no longer trusted. He spent his days hunting, trapping, and chopping wood, filling the hours with hard labor to silence the voice in his head that accused him of cowardice. The ghost of his sister Sarah was a constant presence now, her face superimposed over the terrified girl in the street, her stolen locket a symbol of his compounding failures. His life was a Spartan ritual of survival. He ate when he had food, starved when he didn't. He spoke to no one, unless necessary, his words becoming as scarce as the gold in the dried-up creek beds. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, grief, guilt, and a simmering, directionless anger. He had made peace with hunger, with loneliness, with the lonesome whisper of the wind that seemed to carry the names of all the people he had lost. One bitter afternoon, with the sky the color of a fresh bruise and the promise of a blizzard in the air, Boone rode his mule into Mercy Ridge for salt and flour. He kept his head down, his hat pulled low, avoiding the gazes of the few people who still remembered him as something more than a hermit. As he tied his mule to the hitching post outside the general store, he saw her. She was slumped against the wall of the livery stable, a threadbare shawl pulled tight around a bundle in her arms. Her face was gaunt, her lips chapped and blue from the cold, but it was her eyes that held him. They weren't pleading or broken. They were filled with a fierce, desperate exhaustion and the look of a person who had run out of road but refused to lie down and die on it. No one else seemed to notice her. They walked past their collars turned up against the wind, their minds on their own hearths and suppers. Something in him, a long dormant ember of the man he used to be, stirred. He walked over his boots, crunching in the thin layer of frost on the ground. She didn't beg, that was the thing. She looked up at him, her voice a dry rasp. "Don't want charity," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the bundle she cradled. "Just one night, where they can sleep warm." Boone didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. He saw the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of the blanket. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the single worn silver dollar he had left the money meant for his own supplies. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was a compulsion, an act of penance for the man he had failed to be in front of the bank. "Take it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He pressed the coin into her cold, trembling hand. "Ain't much." He tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, before she could speak, before he could change his mind. He didn't buy salt or flour. He just untied his mule and rode out of town, the familiar ache of an empty stomach, a dull counterpoint to the sharp, fresh sting of his own futility. Looking back was how pain followed you home, and Boone's home was already full. That night, he sat by his hearth, boiling water for tea he didn't have, watching the flames consume the last of his dry pine. He was trying to get full-on smoke and memory alone, and he figured he'd find out by morning if a man could. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, restless thing, a dark passage of time haunted by the glint of a silver locket and the echo of a gunshot he should have prevented. Dawn arrived, not with a gentle whisper of melting snow, but with a sound he hadn't heard in years. A knock. It was soft, hesitant, like a hand testing the strength of the wood, hoping no one was home. Boone was on his feet in an instant, the iron poker from the hearth heavy in his hand. No one knocked out here. They either barged in with guns drawn, or they didn't come at all. He moved to the door, his stockinged feet silent on the cold floorboards. The knock came again, 3 faint taps that were nearly lost in the rising wind. He eased the door open a crack. It was her, the woman from town. Her hair was a tangled mess, dusted with fresh snow. Her lips were a shade bluer than before. But she wasn't holding one bundle now. She was holding 2. In her arms, wrapped in swaddling that looked impossibly clean against her own grime, were 2 newborns. They were so small, so still. They looked less like babies and more like porcelain dolls. She looked up at him, and the fight he'd seen in her eyes yesterday was gone, replaced by a raw, bottomless vulnerability. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice breaking as she swayed on her feet. The image of his sister's face flashed in his mind, pale and broken. "Because no one helped my sister." The words were a silent scream in his soul. This time would be different. This time he wouldn't just stand there. Without a word, he stepped aside and opened the door wide. She stumbled in, not walked, as if the threshold marked the end of her endurance. Whatever had been holding her together snapped. Boone caught her elbow before she collapsed, guiding her to the ragged cot near the hearth. The twins didn't cry. They just blinked their dark, solemn eyes at the smoke-stained ceiling, too new to understand the cruelty of the world they had entered. Boone knelt beside her. "They yours?" She nodded, her breath coming in shuddering gasps. "Mine and his. But he's gone." "Gone how?" "Shot," she whispered the word, a small, sharp stone in her throat. 3 days ago. We buried him near the river. I kept walking." He didn't ask why she walked or how she found his cabin. The why didn't matter. He stood, poured the last of the boiled water into a mug, and handed it to her. She took it without thanks, her movements slow and numb. Boone found himself staring at the twins. One had a shock of dark curls, the other a bare fuzz of gold. He hadn't been this close to a baby since Sarah. The thought was a fresh jab of pain. "You got names?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up. "I'm Ruth. This is Clara," she touched the dark-haired baby. "And this is Seth." "I'm Boone." A pause stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. "I remember," Ruth said. "From town. The dollar." Boone shrugged. "Wasn't doing me no good." "It saved us," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I bought milk, got a room. Had the babies there. It gave me one night of not dying." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He simply added another log to the fire, a silent promise against the coming storm. He had failed to act in the face of violence, but here, in the face of desperation, he could offer this. A warm room, a moment of peace. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. The peace was a fragile, fleeting thing. For 3 days the blizzard raged, sealing them inside the small cabin, a world unto themselves. Boone hunted in the brief lulls, bringing back scrawny rabbits that Ruth stewed with dried roots. They fell into a quiet rhythm, a partnership born of necessity. He tended the fire and secured the cabin. She tended the children, her hands, though still thin, growing steadier each day. They rarely spoke, but a silent understanding grew between them. They were two people who had run out of road, and for now this small, warm space was enough. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun was a weak, watery eye in a pale sky, and the world outside was a pristine blanket of white. The silence that followed the blizzard was profound, heavy. It was the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, muffled by the deep snow, not one horse, but several moving with a steady, purposeful cadence. Boone was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for the rifle, leaning against the hearth. Ruth went pale, gathering the twins into her arms and backing away from the door, her body a shield. The knock was nothing like her own had been. It was loud, hard, and arrogant, 3 sharp raps that didn't ask for entry so much as demanded. A voice followed, cold and laced with a chilling amusement that Boone recognized instantly. "Boone Fletcher, I know you're in there. A little bird told me you've taken in some strays." It was Silas Kane. Boone's blood ran cold. He motioned for Ruth to stay hidden behind the heavy oak table he'd turned on its side. He cracked the door an inch, the iron latch holding firm. Through the gap, he saw them. Silas sat casually on a magnificent black stallion, looking down at the cabin as if it were a curious anthill. 4 of his men flanked him, their faces hard, their hands resting on their pistols. They weren't Vane's thuggish cowhands. These were killers. Silas smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. He wasn't wearing a bandana now, and Boone could see his face, clearly sharp, intelligent features, and eyes the color of a winter sky, so pale they seemed almost transparent. And in them Boone saw it again, that cold, dismissive look from the street in Mercy Ridge. "I'm looking for a woman," Silas called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Name of Ruth Wren. Came through town a few days ago. Folks say she was widowed on the trail. A real tragedy." He paused, letting the mock sympathy hang in the air. "She's in possession of something that doesn't belong to her. A map, a deed, something of sentimental value to her late husband's family." Behind Boone, Ruth's breath hitched. "No one here but me, Boone," said his voice a low growl. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, I think there is Fletcher. A man like you hiding out here at the edge of the world. You don't strike me as the type to take in boarders. Unless you have a reason. A debt to pay, perhaps ghosts to quiet." The words were like a punch to the gut. How could he know it had to be a guess, a cruel shot in the dark? "You've got the wrong cabin," Boone said, his grip tightening on the door. "Do I?" Silas's gaze flickered past Boone toward the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "That's a lot of firewood for one man. Keeping the little ones warm," he sighed dramatically. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just send the woman out, her and the brats, and the map. We'll be on our way. No one else needs to get hurt." The unspoken threat was clear. Today. Boone's mind raced. This wasn't just about a claim. The way Silas spoke, the way he looked right through him, the taunt about ghosts. It felt personal. But it was wrapped around Ruth. She was the excuse. "She's my wife, Boone," said the lie, coming to him in a flash of desperate inspiration. The words felt foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Her name is Ruth Fletcher. Whatever business you had with her is over." A flicker of something surprise interest crossed Silas's face. He tilted his head, studying Boone with a newfound intensity. "His wife?" he murmured, as if tasting the words. "Well, isn't that a turn of fortune?" He straightened in his saddle. "All right, Fletcher. We'll play it your way. For now." He turned to his men. "Let's ride." He wheeled his horse around, but paused, looking back over his shoulder. His voice dropped, becoming quiet and venomous. "But know this. The past never stays buried. And some debts are paid in blood." With a final chilling smile, he spurred his horse and rode off, his men following like black-clad specters against the snow. They vanished into the timberline, leaving only the tracks of their horses and a silence that was far more menacing than the noise of their arrival. Boone slammed the door and bolted it. He turned to Ruth, who was staring at him, her face a mask of terror and confusion. "They'll be back," she whispered. I know Boone set his mind whirling. Silas Kane wasn't just a bank robber. He was something else, something with a purpose. And that purpose, Boone was beginning to fear, had as much to do with him as it did with her. He had opened his door to a widow and her children, seeking a small measure of atonement. Instead, he had invited the devil himself to his doorstep. The threat of Silas Kane settled over the homestead like a perpetual winter frost, chilling every moment of peace. Boone no longer saw him as a random outlaw, but as a specter with a hidden agenda. Silas's words, "ghosts to quiet debts paid in blood," echoed in his mind, stirring the hornet's nest of his past. He began to fortify the cabin, barring the windows at night, and setting snares along the main trail, not to catch animals, but to listen for the telltale snap of a twig under a heavy boot. He took Ruth to a secluded clearing deep in the woods and taught her how to handle the rifle. "You don't aim with your eye," he instructed, his voice low and patient. "You aim with your breath. Squeeze, don't pull." At first, her hands trembled, the weight of the weapon foreign and terrible. She had brought life into the world. Taking it was an unnatural act. But the memory of Silas's cold eyes was a powerful motivator. Her fear slowly hardened into resolve. Her hesitant questions became sharper, her aim steadier. Her dialogue, once soft and uncertain, found a new edge. "Show me again," she'd say, her jaw set. "How to reload faster." Boone saw the change in her, the transformation from victim to survivor, and it stirred a protective instinct in him, so fierce it startled him. Their shared danger forged a bond deeper than words. They moved around the small cabin in a silent dance of domesticity and defense. In the evenings, while the twins slept, they would sit by the fire, the rifle propped between them. It was in these quiet moments that the walls around them began to crumble. "My husband, Daniel," Ruth said one night, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man, but he was a dreamer. He believed in the best in people even when they showed him their worst. This claim, he thought it was our salvation, a place to build a school, a chapel." She looked into the flames. His family saw only silver. They called his dreams a weakness. "It ain't a weakness to want to build something," Boone said gruffly, surprising himself. Meanwhile, Silas Kane began to play his cruel game. He didn't launch a direct assault. Instead, he terrorized them from a distance. One morning, Boone found a dead raven nailed to his barn door, a single black feather tucked under its wing, a symbol used by regulators back in the territory, a marker for a man condemned. A few days later, the livery in Mercy Ridge burned to the ground. No one saw who did it, but the word came back to Boone. Via a frightened trapper, a message had been scorched into the stable wall. "Ghosts don't stay buried, Fletcher." Sheriff Garvey rode out to the cabin, his face grim. "It's you they're after, Boone. This isn't about the woman anymore. Kane's men are asking questions in town, not about a silver claim, but about a rock slide, an old mining accident up in the Trinity Alps 10 years back. Boone's blood turned to ice. The Trinity Alps, the day Sarah died. They're not just outlaws, Garvey continued, shaking his head. They're methodical. They're hunting you. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous, Boone could hardly bear to look at it. Silas Kane wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost himself, a ghost from the worst day of Boone's life. Ruth and her claim were just the bait, the elaborate stage dressing for a play of revenge that had been years in the making. That night, a fever took hold of Clara. Her small body burned with heat, and her cries were weak and raspy. Ruth was frantic, pacing the floor, her newfound strength dissolving into primal maternal fear. Boone worked tirelessly, brewing pine needle tea and pressing cool, damp cloths to the baby's forehead. He sat up with her all night, his large, rough hand gently stroking her back, until his own exhaustion blurred the edges of the room. Near dawn, the fever broke. Clara's breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Ruth slumped in a chair, looked at Boone with eyes raw from weeping and sleeplessness. "You stayed," she whispered. He just knotted his throat too tight to speak. In the fragile life of this child, he saw the life he had failed to save. In protecting Ruth's family, he was trying to rewrite the ending to his own tragic story. Ruth reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I don't know who you're running from, Boone," she said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore." The next day, Boone knew he had to face the ghost head on. He rode toward town, telling Ruth he was going for supplies. But his path took him along the high ridge of vantage point, where he knew Kane's men kept a lookout. He was drawing them out. He didn't have to wait long. 2 of Kane's men intercepted him on the trail. But it was Silas himself who emerged from the pines, his black stallion moving with silent grace. Taking a ride, Fletcher's Silas asked, his smile as sharp as a shard of glass. "What do you want?" Kane Boone's hand stayed loose near his colt. Silas dismounted, walking a slow circle around Boone's mule. I want to watch you suffer. I want to watch you build a little life, a little hope." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin, "And then I want to burn it to the ground. Just like you did to me." Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about." Silas stopped, his pale eyes boring into Boone. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "Don't you Trinity Alps? Black Creek Mine, a rock slide that was no accident. A young man named Elias left for dead." He watched the blood drain from Boone's face, and his smile widened. "Ah, there it is. The flicker of memory. Elias was my brother." The world tilted on its axis. The bank robbery, the locket, the taunts, it all snapped into focus. This was never about Ruth. It was never about silver. It was about him. "It was an accident," Boone choked out the words, tasting like ash. "The timbers gave way." Did they? Silas's voice was dangerously soft. Or were they weakened by a man in a hurry? A man who ran and left another to be buried alive. A man who let his own sister die to save his own skin. The accusation was a lie, a twisted version of the truth, but it struck Boone with the force of a physical blow. He had run, yes, but to get help. When he returned, it was too late. Sarah and Elias were both gone, buried under 100 tons of rock and shale. He had lived with the guilt of his sister's death every day since. He never knew Elias had a brother. The woman Silas continued savoring every word her claim. It was all just a happy coincidence. The perfect lure to draw the rat out of his hole. I'm not here for her land, Fletcher. I'm here for yours. The 6 feet of it you'll be buried in. The confrontation was cut short by the distant crack of a rifle, Sheriff Garvey, creating a diversion from the opposite ridge. Kane's men turned distracted, and in that moment, Boone wheeled his mule around and galloped back toward the cabin, his mind a maelstrom of shock and horror. He burst through the door, his face ashen. "Pack what you can," he said to Ruth, his voice ragged. "We have to go. Now." "What is it? What did he say?" "It's not you he wants." Boone said the terrible truth finally laid bare. "It's me." He had thought he was protecting her from her past, but all along he had been dragging her into his. The knowledge that he was the true target changed everything. The threat was no longer a perimeter to be defended, but a shadow attached to his very soul. Silas Kane would not stop, not until Boone was destroyed. Running was no longer an option. It was a death sentence, for Silas would hunt him to the ends of the earth, and he would use anyone Boone cared about as leverage. Silas, robbed of his dramatic confrontation, escalated his campaign of terror from psychological warfare to open assault. He no longer hid in the shadows. He wanted the entire region to know that Mercy Ridge and everyone in it belonged to him. He and his men descended on the town like a plague, their first target, a symbol of community and order, the town hall. They rode in at dusk, torches held high. Sheriff Garvey and a handful of deputized townsfolk tried to make a stand, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Silas didn't want a battle. He wanted to make a statement. He watched with cold satisfaction as the flames consumed the old wooden structure, the town's records, and its fragile sense of security, turning to ash and smoke. As the building burned, he had a message delivered to Boone's cabin, pinned to the door with a Bowie knife. "The next fire will be warmer. I know you like to keep the little ones toasty. Meet me at the old Black Creek mine at dawn on the 3rd day. Come alone, or the woman and her brats will see what happens when you leave family to burn." The Black Creek mine. The very place where Boone's life had shattered the tomb of his sister and Silas's brother. It was a summons to his own personal hell. Ruth read the note over his shoulder, her face grim. "You can't go," she said, her voice fierce. "It's a trap." "It's always been a trap." Boone replied, his eyes distant, fixed on the ghosts of the past. "If I don't go, he'll come here. He'll do what he says. Then we fight him here together." "No." Boone's voice was flat final. He looked at her, at the twins sleeping peacefully in their cradle, and a terrible clarity settled over him. For 10 years he had been running from this moment, hiding from the man he was that day. The only way to protect his new family was to face the old one. "This is my fight. It started with me, and it ends with me." Over the next 2 days, a heavy, unspoken dread filled the cabin. Boone cleaned his weapons with methodical precision, his movements slow and deliberate. He spent hours just watching the children, memorizing the shape of their faces, the sound of their breathing. He and Ruth barely spoke, but their silence was a conversation in itself, filled with fear, regret, and a deep, aching affection. On the eve of the 3rd day, as a storm began to gather in the mountains, blowing a cold, mournful wind down the valley, Ruth came to him. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice strained. She held out a small leather-bound journal. It was Daniel's. "I found it after he was gone. I never read it all. It was too painful." Boone took the journal. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because he mentions the Black Creek mine," she whispered. "He was there, Boone, the day of the rock slide." Boone's blood ran cold. He opened the journal. Daniel's handwriting was neat, almost poetic. He wrote of his dreams for the silver claim, but as he flipped through the pages, a darker story emerged. Daniel wrote of being a young surveyor working for the mining company, of being pressured to cut corners. And then he found the entry for the day of the accident. They made me set the charges, said it would speed things up. I knew the Western Wall was unstable, but I was young and I was scared. When the ground started to shake, I ran. I didn't look back. I heard them screaming. A boy named Elias and the foreman's girl, Sarah. The company paid me to be quiet, gave me the deed to the high slope claim as my price for silence. This entire dream, this future I want to build for Ruth, is founded on their graves. Boone dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The truth was more horrific than Silas's twisted version. Daniel Wren, the good man, and the dreamer, wasn't just a witness. He was a cause. His legacy, the very thing Ruth was fighting for, was built on a foundation of cowardice and blood money. The ground beneath Boone's feet felt like it was crumbling all over again. He now had to walk into a trap set by his nemesis, armed with the devastating knowledge that the dream he was fighting to protect was born from the same tragedy that had ruined his life and created his greatest enemy. The stakes were no longer just life and death. They were about truth, legacy, and the impossibly fine line between a sinner and a saint. The wind howled like a banshee as Boone rode toward the Black Creek mine, the storm breaking over the mountains with a furious intensity. Rain fell in cold, hard sheets, turning the trail to a slick river of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, and the sky was a canvas of bruised purples and angry grays, lit by jagged flashes of lightning. The world itself seemed to be raging against the confrontation that was to come. The mine entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain, its timbers groaning under the assault of the wind. A single lantern flickered just inside, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. This was Sarah's grave. This was where his life had ended and his haunting began. He dismounted, leaving his horse tethered to a stunted pine, and walked toward the entrance, his rifle held ready. The air grew colder as he stepped inside, thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else, the metallic tang of old sorrow. Silas was waiting for him in the main chamber, a cavernous space where the main veins had once been worked. Ruth was there, tied to a thick support beam, her face pale, but her eyes defiant. Two of Silas's men stood guard, their pistols drawn. "Welcome home, Fletcher," Silas said, his voice echoing in the vast dark space. The lantern light caught the manic gleam in his eyes. "I thought it was only fitting we end things where they began. A family reunion of sorts." "Let her go," Kane Boone said, his voice dangerously level. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it is," Silas purred, walking a slow circle around him. "But a man needs an audience for his final act. And she needs to see the kind of man she's thrown her lot in with. A coward who ran." "I ran for help," Boone bit out, the old wound tearing open. "A likely story," Silas laughed, a sharp, unhinged sound. "My brother Elias, he was a good boy. Trusted people. He trusted you. He looked up to you. And you left him to suffocate in the dark." He stopped, his face inches from Boone's. "I spent 10 years hunting for you. 10 years dreaming of this moment. Building my reputation, my crew, all for this. The bank, the locket. All of it was a prologue. To bring you right here to the place where you murdered my family so I could murder yours." He gestured to Ruth. "I have to admit, your little charade with the widow was a stroke of genius I didn't anticipate. It makes this so much sweeter. To give you a taste of hope, of a future. And then rip it away." Boone's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. His grief and guilt warred with a cold, righteous fury. But then he remembered Daniel's journal. This tragedy was bigger and uglier than either of them knew. "You're wrong," Silas Boone said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "It wasn't just me and Elias and Sarah in here that day. There was a fourth person, a surveyor. His name was Daniel Wren." Silas frowned, the rhythm of his tirade broken. "What are you talking about?" "He's the one who set the bad charges." Boone continued, his eyes locking on Ruth, trying to prepare her. He was scared. He ran. The mining company paid him off to keep quiet. The silver claim. It was his silence money. Ruth's eyes widened in horror and disbelief. "No," she breathed. "He's lying," Silas roared, but a seed of doubt had been planted. "Am I?" Boone pressed on, his gaze unwavering. "Your brother wasn't the only victim that day. Sarah died too. My sister. You think I wouldn't have torn this mountain apart with my bare hands to save her? I didn't run from a choice, Silas. I ran from a disaster your brother's killer set in motion." The cavern fell silent, and the only sound the dripping of water and the howl of the storm outside. The foundation of Silas's decade-long vendetta had cracked. His righteous quest for revenge was suddenly tainted, complicated. But the hatred in his eyes was too deep to be reasoned with. "Liar!" he screamed, and lunged, not at Boone, but at Ruth, pulling a knife and pressing it to her throat. "It doesn't matter. You were here. You will pay." That's when the second twist of the knife came, not from Silas, but from Boone himself. He had a choice. He could give in to the rage, to the desire for pure, simple revenge against the man who had tormented him. Or he could fight for something more. He looked at Ruth, at the terror in her eyes, mixed with the dawning, devastating understanding of her husband's legacy, and he made his choice. He would not become Silas. He would not let this place, this tomb of ghosts, claim another soul. He dropped his rifle. It clattered to the rocky ground with a deafening finality. "Let her go," Boone said, his voice calm. "It's me you want. Take me. Let her and the children live. Let this die with us." Silas stared, momentarily stunned by the move. It was the last thing he expected. In that split second of hesitation, one of his men, unnerved by the shifting narrative, took a step forward. "Boss." It was all the opening Boone needed. He kicked the rifle, sending it spinning across the floor toward Ruth. As Silas's men instinctively looked toward the weapon, Boone charged. He didn't run at Silas, but at the main support beam near the mine's entrance, a beam he knew from his own time in the mine, was rotten, barely holding. He slammed his shoulder into it with all his strength. The wood groaned, splintered, and then cracked with the sound of a breaking bone. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The whole mine shuddered. The men panicked, their loyalty to Silas forgotten in the face of being buried alive. One of them scrambled for the exit. The other fired his pistol wildly, the shot ricocheting off the cavern walls. Silas, enraged at losing control, shoved Ruth aside and drew his pistol on Boone. But the mine was coming down. A huge timber fell from the ceiling, crashing between them, separating them. Boone scrambled toward Ruth, cutting her bonds with his knife. "Go," he yelled, pushing her toward the entrance. "Get out." The storm outside and the storm inside the mine merged into a single, deafening roar. Rocks fell. The flickering lantern was extinguished, plunging the cavern into near-total darkness, lit only by the flashes of lightning from the entrance. From the darkness, Silas screamed Boone's name, a cry of pure, impotent fury. Boone grabbed Ruth's hand and pulled her through the collapsing tunnel. They burst out into the lashing rain, just as the entrance to the Black Creek mine caved in, completely sealing the darkness, the ghosts, and Silas Kane within. Boone stood heaving for breath, the rain washing the dust and grime from his face. He looked at Ruth, whose expression was a mixture of relief and heartbreak. He had survived. He had saved her. But in doing so, he had been forced to destroy the idealized memory of the man she had loved. The physical climax was over, but the emotional one was just beginning. In his pocket, he felt the cold, hard shape of something he'd pulled from Silas's duster during their brief struggle, a small silver oval. His sister's locket. Falling action. The ride back to Mercy Ridge was a somber, silent procession. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cold. The sky above was a tender, bruised blue, but it offered little comfort. Boone rode beside Ruth, the silence between them heavier than any mountain. He had given her back her life, but taken away her past. They found Mercy Ridge in a state of shock and mourning. The town hall was a smoldering skeleton, its ashes a stark black wound in the center of the community. Sheriff Garvey met them on the outskirts, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "He's gone," Garvey asked, looking toward the mountains. Boone nodded. The mine collapsed. "It's over." The sheriff looked from Boone to Ruth, sensing the new complicated sorrow that clung to them. He simply clapped Boone on the shoulder. "The town's grateful. We'll rebuild." That night, back in the quiet safety of the cabin, the carefully constructed walls between them finally gave way. The twins were asleep, their innocent dreams undisturbed by the sins of their fathers. Ruth sat at the small wooden table staring at Daniel's journal, which lay open before her. "All this time," she said, her voice hollow, "I was fighting for a lie. The school, the chapel. It was all built on his guilt." Boone sat opposite her, his hands resting on the table. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comforts. He offered her the truth. He was a scared kid who made a terrible choice, he said quietly. Maybe he spent the rest of his life trying to be the man he should have been that day. Tears streamed down Ruth's face, silent and steady. "But what does that make me? What does that make our children? Are we all just a part of his lie?" "No," Boone said, his voice firm. He reached across the table not to touch her, but to close the journal, gently pushing it aside. "His story is over, Ruth. Ours is just beginning. We decide what we build now. Not him. Not Silas. Us." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "How the claim is worthless now. Morally, it's blood money." "The claim might be," Boone agreed. "But the land isn't. It's good land. It can be farmed. It can support families. Its value isn't in the silver buried beneath it, but in the life that can grow on top of it." He paused and then made a decision. "We can sell a portion of it. Use the money not for us, but for the town. To rebuild what they lost because of my past." A flicker of the old fire returned to Ruth's eyes. The idea of building something real, something honest, from the ashes of Daniel's flawed dream seemed to take root. "We could help them rebuild the town hall," she said, the thought taking shape. "Make it a real community center, with a schoolroom, for Clara and Seth and all the other children." It was a new dream, born not of guilt, but of shared responsibility. A future based on their own truth, not the flawed dreams of the past. In that moment, they stopped being two broken people leaning on each other for survival, and became two whole people choosing to build a life together. The past was not erased, but they had found a way to carry its weight without being crushed by it. Months passed. The raw wound of the past began to scar over, healing into something that could be lived with. True to their word, Boone and Ruth used the legitimate resources from the sale of the outlying parts of the Wren, claimed to fund the rebuilding of the Mercy Ridge Town Hall. The project became a symbol of the town's resilience, and the community came together with ranchers donating timber and townsfolk volunteering their labor. It was no longer just a building. It was a testament to their refusal to be broken. On a bright, clear autumn day, the day the foundation stone was to be laid, the entire town gathered. The air was filled with the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sounds of laughter and hammering. Ruth stood with Clara and Seth, now toddlers, watching as the men prepared to set the heavy cornerstone in place. She had become a respected leader in the community, her strength and integrity an anchor for them all. Boone approached her, his face serious but calm. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the tarnished silver locket he had recovered from Silas. "I never told you the whole story of my sister," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. He explained everything: the locket as a birthday gift, her dream of being a teacher, his promise to always protect her, and the suffocating guilt of his failure. It was the first time he had spoken of it aloud in 10 years, and the words, once freed, seemed to lose some of their power over him. Ruth listened, her expression full of a deep, quiet empathy. When he was finished, she simply placed her hand over his. Boone walked to the cornerstone where Sheriff Garvey was waiting. He knelt and, with a sense of ceremony, placed the silver locket deep inside the cavity where the mortar would be poured. He was not just burying a piece of metal. He was laying his ghosts to rest, investing his pain and his past into the foundation of a future he was helping to build, but for others. It was an act of forgiveness for Daniel, for himself, and for a world that was often cruel but still held the possibility of redemption. As the stone was lowered into place, sealing the locket within the heart of the new Mercy Ridge, Fletcher felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for a decade. He walked back to Ruth and his children, no longer a man haunted by what he had lost, but a man defined by what he was building. He put his arm around Ruth, and together they watched the new walls rise against the endless western sky, a promise that a person's true legacy is not the story they inherit, but the one they choose to write for themselves.